All right, friends, welcome to week 5. This is going to be lecture 4. This is going to be our final lecture for today. So, over the course of these last 2 weeks, we've been spending a lot of time talking about missional leadership, the kinds of questions that we ought to ask, the kind of person that we ought to recognize as necessary. We talked about the variety of contexts that we can find ourselves in and why context matters, because there's certain demands of missional leadership that are made upon us depending upon the context we find ourselves in. The last thing that I want to talk to us about in terms of missional leadership, at least at this stage in the game. Now, we're going to pick up even more as we move into week 6, and I give you a primer in how we understand ourselves doing community engagement. Now, I say it's a primer because we're not going to get into everything that I would want to get into, because we actually have developed an entire new class for that as a part of our missional multiplication degree. It's called Community Assessment and Evaluation. And we're going to have someone teach a lot of those different elements about how do we get engaged and evaluate our community and make an impact in our community. But we're going to do a primer on that next week. And you're going to hear even more missional leadership in that. But one of the things I want to talk about is here as we bring this to a close for this week is the kind of virtues necessary for what might be considered missional leadership. Now, I want to tell you this. So I had the privilege of having an executive coach in my last ministry. And this is the part that I think is going to surprise many of you, because I think many of us are geared towards, when we think about leadership, to have this aversion to leadership because of the way it comes across as CEO or corporate style. My executive coach was a corporate exec. He was a man who had worked for decades at Caterpillar. They're the ones that make the really big machinery. But this man lived a life of a Jesus follower and understood his leadership within the context of what I would call a missional ethos. And I asked him one time to share with me what are key for him to understand what makes a good leader. And he gave me these 5 virtues that I just feel like I want to share with you, because you're thinking about what this looks like in your own life. I think these 5 are key. And so he gave me 5, and I'm going to give you the 5, and then I'm going to break them down just briefly here. Number 1 is integrity. Number 2 is vision. Number 3 is courage. Number 4 is compassion. And number 5 is humility. Let us start with integrity. He said that integrity is key. If you're going to move any group of people anywhere, they have to know that you can be trusted. And by that, he meant integrity is not just us doing the right thing when nobody's looking. When we talk about integrity, we ought to also think in terms of what we might call structural integrity. Like a house has structural integrity. You can place weight upon it. It doesn't crumble. It doesn't crack. It doesn't fail under pressure, right? It holds things together. Our lives have to have the kind of capacity to hold things together. Like, is there something about our lives that can be trusted, that is anchored, that's rooted, that's not flippant, that's not fickle, that's not easily blown to the top, to the right or to the left? In what ways does our lives model, right, that kind of integrity? One of the things that he said to me one time that just stuck with me, he says, 1 oops can erase 1,000 attaboys. He said, people are looking for someone that they can trust. Not someone who's perfect, but someone who, in the midst of difficult and challenging times, can be staid and true, and that can be anchored to in the midst of uncertainty and unpredictability. So I think integrity is key for us. The second thing he said was vision. To be a missional leader, to be someone who embodies something worth following, is one who can see beyond the moment. Leaders at some capacity, maybe this is sort of what makes a leader, is their ability to see further down the road than a lot of other people. And so vision, the capacity to not only see, but then to communicate what we see in a way that is compelling for others, or that invites them to also see it with us, so that we can collectively see further and more holistically together than I might otherwise see by myself. Vision is something that shapes, leads, and points us in a trajectory in our mission and ministry. When you set a vision in place, you are pointing somewhere. I meet too many ministry leaders who lead ad hoc, moment by moment, situation by situation, crisis by crisis. And so there's nothing that's guiding or directing every bit of their passion, every bit of their energy, every bit of their attention when it comes to what they're giving themselves to as leaders. And so vision gives us that locus, that focal point, that's something that continues to move us forward. It ensures that the decisions we make right now that seem like good decisions in the moment don't sabotage our capacity to do what needs to be done down the road. So integrity and vision. The third one is courage. Being a missional leader will present you temptation upon temptation to quit, give up, take exit ramps along the way, to surrender to cowardice, or to opt for comfort. Missional leadership will require the capacity to acknowledge fear, to recognize the cost, and to push forward and push through in meaningful ways. Courage happens in those moments when there might be pressure to act and do something contrary to what the missional ethos of Jesus is all about, and you stay true to it. I'm going to give you an example. My pastor in Clarksville, Tennessee was a beautiful example of this. We had started, as I mentioned in previous lectures, reaching people that no one else wanted to reach. And we had this unique family in one of our congregations that I would basically relive this exact same experience in my own ministry. And we had someone of means who was frustrated by the messiness that this person and his family had created. And they basically had said it's either them or this family. They weren't going to stay if we kept this family. And my pastor and I almost to a T had this exact same experience later on in my ministry. Said, you know what? There's 200 churches in this community that would love to have you and your money, but maybe one church that's going to have her. We're going to choose to be that one church. And it cost us thousands. When I say thousands, I mean thousands of dollars. Took a hit to our budget, took a hit to our staffing, but it was the right thing to do. Courage is the capacity to do the right thing, even when it's the hard thing. Even when it's the thing that demands the most, costs the most, and maybe even in the short run gives us the least. But missional leadership requires courage. It requires the ability to stay in the fray when things get difficult. If you take my life management and personal renewal class, one of the things we're going to talk about in there is resilience, because I believe that courage and resilience go hand in hand. We can't stay courageous if we're not resilient. We have to be able to stay steady even when the winds of change and the winds of complexity and the winds of threat are swirling about us. We've got to stay true to the mission and the calling of God. Integrity, vision, and courage. The fourth one is compassion. Now this might seem, this man who told me this operated a plant that had thousands of employees. He was at the high end of the food chain. And you would think compassion would be a weird one for him to tell you this is what makes an effective leader. But this is a man who knew his employees. That if someone died, he was the first one to show up at the funeral. He would walk through the plant, knew their names, knew their children's names, and cared for what was going on in their lives. If they faced a place of brokenness, he was one of the first ones to step in. And he kept saying, we've all heard it, people don't care unless they know you care about them, right? They won't care about what you care about unless you first have cared about them. But compassion isn't manipulation. Compassion is born of empathy. Compassion is the willingness to step into the brokenness of someone's life and care deeply for them. Missional leadership springs from compassion. It springs from our capacity to be deeply moved at the core of who we are for the sake of caring about what God cares about. Compassion is evidenced in the way in which we care about people, where we don't just see them as a means to our ends, but when we believe that they are an end in of themselves. They're not an object for us to fulfill our dreams and aspirations, but where we see them and love them enough to help them to fulfill what God dreams and aspires for them in their lives. So integrity, vision, courage, compassion. And the fifth one I would say is humility. And I love when Tim talked about this. He just helped us recognize often that we weren't going to have all the answers. That we're not smart enough, wise enough, sharp enough. We haven't had all the experiences. We've got to stay learners. We've got to stay willing to admit when we're wrong, confess it, and grow from it and learn from it. We're never a finished product, and we oughtn't expect to be. We're always gonna be in this growth cycle. Humility is the willingness to defer to someone who may know better. I'll never forget the moment when we began to make these missional significant shifts in our congregation. We had to reprioritize our budget. And if we're going to become a church planting church, we had to rethink how we're going to do our budget. So I spent countless hours trying to figure this out. When in my finance team, I had 3 people that's what they did for a living. I literally had a CPA on my finance team. And I began to realize, why am I trying to figure this out? Like, this isn't my thing. This is not what I'm great at. So I had to defer to them. And they were going to set the trend line for how we handled our finances. And it wasn't in my control, nor would I get credit, nor would I even be affirmed as the one who came up with a really good idea. But I had to recognize, for the community to go forward in the way that it needed to go forward, I had to be willing to give up power in order for that to happen. That doesn't make me a hero, because I was a hard head in getting there, because I felt like I was responsible. I had to have that on my shoulder, when in fact that was what God had trained and equipped other people to be able to do in a way that was far better than anything that I could do. And so I want us to think about these virtues in terms of our missional leadership: integrity, vision, courage, compassion, and humility, as being keystones to what we embrace and believe to be the role of our leadership in this world. So in the midst of all that we've talked about in missional leadership, and there's so much more that could be said and that I would love to say, and I do talk about significant portions of this in our course on missional movements in an age of complexity. In fact, I've migrated some of the information I used to do in this course into that one so that there's not overlap. I mean, we talk about transformational leadership. We talk about how do we shift congregations. That's for a different course. But what I want us to understand is there are certain postures, orientations, and ways of leading in the culture that we find ourselves currently.